You'll see videos of athletes like LeBron James doing quarter reps with a squat.
Yeah, buddy. Lightweight, baby!
What's up, guys? I'm Josh and I Lift Things, and I'm here to talk about range of motion. Is bigger always better? My girlfriend says it doesn't matter. Are partials worth it? Length and stretch muscles, stretches and contractions, what does it all mean? So, range of motion, or ROM for short, can be described in a few different ways, and you can get especially nitpicky with stuff like active ROM and passive ROM. The easiest way I try to explain it for beginners is how far a weight travels during a lift. And that weight could be a barbell, a dumbbell, your own body, or anything else. And it gets even messier there, where some people disagree on what is a full range of motion. Let's take a squat, for instance. You could squat to 90 degrees or parallel, and most people would call that good. Or you could squat all the way ATG, or ass to grass, and some people call that full range of motion. So the question remains, does using a full range of motion even matter? Is there a benefit to focusing on certain parts of a movement? You'll see videos of athletes like LeBron James doing quarter reps with a squat. Most people will roast them, saying how absolutely useless and dumb that looks, but these NBA trainers know more than you. How often do you see someone squatting ass to grass before going up for a dunk? They are training specificity. They are using quarter reps because that is typically about as low as a player will get before they go up for a dunk. Recreating the actions that your athlete will use on the court or out on the field in the weight room can be very important. But for just a regular gym bro, do you need to do quarter rep squats? Probably not. Other people, such as bodybuilders, will talk about ranges of motion, often trying to train in the stretch position. I know the term stretch-mediated hypertrophy has been blowing up these days, even though it is severely misunderstood. And then if we take a look at basic physics, like for instance, take a look at this bicep curl. As you see, to overcome the mid-range, when the bar is basically straight out, you have to produce the most torque to overcome that. Does that mean that it would be the most beneficial to only train in the mid-range of movements? Well, maybe, but before I get into the science, please let me clear up some misconceptions people often have with a couple terms. I've sent this link to multiple people. I think it does a great job of explaining stuff. This is stretched position versus lengthened muscle. This is on prescript.com. I'm going to mess this up by Abdurrahman Saluji. Sorry. Too often in fitness and specifically exercise selection, the terms stretched and lengthened are used interchangeably. This is a mistake. Words matter, and how you define them even more so. Let's differentiate between them. Stretched is used to refer to a position in an exercise where the eccentric is completed and the concentric contraction is about to be initiated, like for instance in a barbell curl. At the bottom, when your arms are fully extended, that would be the quote-unquote stretched position. This is completely separate from the anatomical length of a muscle. Let's look at two examples to illustrate this. In a preacher curl, at the bottom of the rep, when the elbow is almost locked, this is termed the stretched position of the exercise. It is not lengthened in an absolute sense, but it is experiencing the maximal stretch possible within the constraints of the exercise being done correctly. Another example is a seated quad extension. When the knee is bent and the hamstring is almost touching the calf before the weight hits the rest of the stack, this is the stretched position of the exercise. Again, this is not a lengthened quad. This is a position in the exercise in which the muscle worked is being stretched before concentric contraction. Note that isometric exercises like plank do not have eccentrics or concentrics, and thus no stretched position. Lengthened is used to refer to the anatomical length of a muscle. Anatomical length typically involves three different positions: fully shortened, mid-range, and fully lengthened. The muscle is weakest in its fully shortened position, strongest in its mid-range, and weaker in its fully lengthened position. This follows a normal distribution illustrated by a bell curve. By understanding where muscles originate and insert and which joints they cross, we can understand their anatomical length positions. Let's use the example of a bicep from earlier with the preacher curl. It is commonly known as an elbow flexor. However, one of the bicep muscles, the biceps brachii, crosses the shoulder joint as well. This means that it performs shoulder flexion in addition to elbow flexion and supination. In order to fully shorten it, we need to have it shortened over both of the joints it crosses. Both the elbow and the shoulder must be flexed. This position can be seen in a high cable bicep curl. In order to find its lengthened range, the inverse is true. Both the shoulder and the elbow must be extended. This position can be replicated in a lengthened cable curl. The mid-range is easiest to find, it's where you're the strongest. Now to move on to the research, here we have the effects of range of motion on resistance training adaptations, a systematic review and meta-analysis. 16 studies were finally included in the systematic review and meta-analysis. Full ROM training produced significantly greater adaptations than partial ROM on muscle strength and lower limb hypertrophy. Furthermore, not statistically significant changes in functional performance were maximized by the full ROM training. Finally, no significant superiority of either ROM was found to produce changes in muscle thickness, pennation angle, and fascicle length. Another one, fucking cookies. Another one, effects of range of motion on muscle development during resistance training interventions, a systematic review. This one's quite interesting. Primarily, the findings suggest that for lower body musculature, there appears to be a benefit to training with a full range of motion, with 3 of 4 studies favoring the style of training. And for the upper body, the evidence is less conclusive, with one study actually suggesting a benefit in favor of partial ROM, while another reporting similar increases in muscle size when training both. However, from the conclusion, it says the evidence implies that their benefits are apparent or only up to a certain range of motion threshold, with advantageous effects attenuating beyond the giving threshold. Alternatively, research on the upper extremities is limited and conflicting, thereby precluding the ability to draw strong practical inferences. I can't fucking read. No study to date has endeavored to investigate how ROM influences muscle growth of the trunk musculature. Here we have impact of range of motion during ecologically valid resistance training protocols on muscle size, subcutaneous fat, and strength. This study says what basically any good coach has said for decades: a common error in practice is allowing the range of motion to be compromised to accommodate a greater absolute external load in an attempt to increase the stress and mechanical loading. Resistance training protocols enforce a wider range of motion, enhance the muscle characteristics that influence force and power production to a greater extent than protocols where the ROM is not as extensive. Interesting point here, adherence to a greater range of motion also provides a better long-term prognosis for retention of training adaptations, for example, after prolonged bed rest and immobilization caused by illness and injury, or indeed during tapering. Here we have a study specifically in women, influence of range of motion resistance training in women early phase adaptations. They used a 1-rep bench press at 10-week, 2 days per week training regimen was used. Subjects were divided into 3 groups. Group 1 trained full range of motion, Group 2 trained 3 partial range of motion sets, and Group 3, serving as a quasi-control, trained with an equal combination of partial and full range of motion sets. All 3 groups experienced an increase in bench press strength. In addition, a statistically significant difference was found between the full range of motion group and the partial and mixed groups. This finding suggests that lifting through a full range of motion was superior to the other training regimens used in this study. That also makes complete sense. If you think about it again from a specificity standpoint, if you're only training, say, the top half of a bench press, you're training mostly your triceps. If you're training the bottom half of the bench, you're training mostly your chest. There's a reason that great power lifters will do like pin presses to work on that sticking point. There's a reason they will do pause bench to work on exploding out of the hole. You have to train these things in tandem if you want to get stronger at the entire movement. This study here says partial versus full range of motion resistance training, a systematic review and meta-analysis. Overall, our results suggest that using a full or long range of motion may enhance results for most outcomes, including strength, speed, power, muscle size, and body composition. But differences in adaptations are trivial to small. As such, partial ROM resistance training might present an efficacious alternative for variation and personal preference, or where injury prevents full range of motion resistance training. In my days of training, I have noticed this extensively. So let's say someone has issues squatting, maybe they are pretty obese, or maybe they're a little bit older. The trick isn't necessarily to never have them do any form of squat movement. They will build up that range of motion as they squat more. And if they don't want to, guess what? They also don't have to. As long as they're performing some type of movement similar to a squat, safe, the range of motion can kind of fuck off. These people aren't training to be bodybuilders or post a juicy pic on fucking Instagram. They're training to be able to walk, and if they fall on the ground, be able to pick themselves back up. This is why it's so important to talk about your goals when you're actually designing a workout routine, or asking someone their goals before you shit on theirs. This study here, bench press at full range of motion produces greater neuromuscular adaptations than partial executions after prolonged resistance training. This is pretty funny here. After 10 weeks of training cessation, the control group declined in all neuromuscular parameters. Based on these findings, the bench press full stands as the most effective exercise to maximize neuromuscular improvements in recreational and well-trained athletes compared with partial ROM variations. That's very important to know. This is not just something that happens with a well-trained athlete or a beginner athlete. It happens with both. Here's effects of changing from full range of motion to partial range of motion on squat kinetics. And this exactly backs up what these NBA coaches have known for a long time. The participants involved in resistance training should consider the use of near maximal partial range of motion squats if their goal is to exert maximal force or power through a limited range of motion. However, because resistance training programs designed to change body composition, for example, hypertrophy or fat loss, are reliant not so much on power and force, but more on total work performed, i.e. volume, high intensity, full range of motion squats should be the focus. Essentially what they say here, if you're doing half the range of motion, you need to do twice the amount of sets to get a similar amount of total work performed. That's not completely true, but you know, it's a good enough baseline. They do note here at the bottom that partial repetition squats performed in the moderate to high repetition range seems to have the least benefit. That makes sense. Not only using a low range of motion, you're also using a pretty low weight. Granted, for a lot of reps, but who cares? Fucking partial squat, dude. Another study I'm not going to completely go over just backs up the last findings. Adaptations to explosive resistance training with partial range of motion are not inferior to full range of motion. Good to know. Here we have the effective range of motion on muscle strength and thickness. This part is very interesting. Although the training volume for the full range of motion group is 36% lower than that of the partial ROM, the results of the study suggest that for strength, lifting a full range of motion was still superior to that of partial. Another main finding was that muscle thickness for full ROM was greater than that for not full ROM, but not significantly so. A really interesting study, partial range of motion resistance training, a feasible bodybuilding training regimen for local or regional muscle hypertrophy. The study is a bit of a nothing burger and instead just kind of talks about this may be beneficial for competitors who desire to give more attention to underdeveloped muscle groups to create better proportion and symmetry. I don't think that really makes sense. Let's talk about partials on like a cable crossover. Specifically, let's talk about the stretch position where they're probably the most useful. If you're only using this partial range of motion, you're not really bringing in any other muscle groups. I think what they maybe mean is like specific muscle fibers or maybe even different heads of a muscle because they're talking about regional hypertrophy. So this study's kind of weird, but at least it is interesting, and I agree with the base conclusion, which is more research is needed to assess the validity of this mode of training within this population. And here's probably the most interesting study and our last, influence of full range of motion versus equalized partial range of motion training on muscle architecture and mechanical properties. And from the conclusions, we can see that muscle fascicle length and specific tension can be increased by pure concentric training if greater range of motion is used. Conversely, restricting the ROM to shorter muscle lengths promotes a greater cross-sectional area and angle-specific strength adaptations. Now, that is the base science covered, and as per usual, you're probably left with more questions than you are answers. So this is my attempt at giving you some type of practical application. Full range of motion is probably preferred most of the time for most people. If you're an athlete whose sports requires specific bouts of strength in specific positions, or if you are compromised in any way because you're elderly, obese, injured, or whatever else, partials could probably be more beneficial for you. It's possible that certain muscle groups will react better to certain ranges of motion, but we just need more science on that. There's pretty good evidence that partials in a stretch position can be useful, but I would never make them the brunt of my training. If you're doing a compound barbell exercise, I would not throw in partials at the end of a set. However, if you're doing a more like isolation style movement and you want to get closer to failure, maybe even let's say on like the last movement for that muscle group for that day, feel free to throw in partials in a quote-unquote stretch position to really hammer it out. As for the regional hypertrophy bit, I'm going to lean towards being doubtful right now, but it's at least an interesting idea. You can watch my video on regional hypertrophy if you want to learn more about it. So once again, most of the time, use as full of a range of motion as you comfortably can. And then if you want to get a little bit closer to failure, feel free on, say, the last movement for that muscle group for that day. Do some partial reps specifically in the stretch position to get super close to failure, and you'll get at least a crazy hell of a pump. If you're an athlete or are immobilized in some type of way, partials may be what you have to do. And guys, that is the video. If you like this style of content, do me a favor, like the video only if you like it. Subscribe to see the next video. I post a new one every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Leave me a comment letting me know what I forgot, why I'm an idiot, why you love me. I respond to every single one of them, and it greatly helps out the channel. Then make sure you subscribe. Then make sure you share to a buddy. One of these days, I'll get through that in one go. If you really like this style of content, you can follow all of these socials. They will be linked in the description down below. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.